like even DEXA can under and overestimate in certain populations. So there isn't one, other than an autopsy, there isn't
That's
one perfect way to measure your body composition.
That's what Jennifer. So the reason I'm laughing is we had Jen Gibson, who now works with the Blackhawks. She's like, murder is your gold standard. She's like, no, I don't want people going out there killing people. She's like, but that is your only gold standard.
It's true. It is the only 100% accurate way to measure body composition, because
what's up, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of the Cheeky Midweeky, where we are making strength and conditioning not boring anymore. And we do that by highlighting the practitioners that make this the best field to work in. As you know, we don't only have strength coaches on. And today, that is one of those days. We have Brian St. Pierre from Precision Nutrition on the show. Brian, thank you for coming on, man. I appreciate you being willing to share and just educate our coaches. So thank you very much for coming on.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Justin. I will say I started my career as a strength and conditioning coach, so I'm a little bit of both historically, but I'm really grateful to be here and looking forward to chatting.
Let's start there. Let's talk about your strength and conditioning journey. How did you get into it, and what was that like for you?
Yeah, so basically, like I finished my college undergrad as like a nutrition major, but wasn't sure what I really wanted to do. Was super into like lifting and fitness and health and well-being and all that jazz, and ended up I played men's league rugby, and so that was one of the ways like they tried to get you on teams, was try to hook you up with jobs. So like teams would kind of if you were a reasonably good player, would try to somewhat compete for your services, and no one was truly competing for my services. I was fine, I was decent, but I wasn't U.S. national team material like some of my actual college teammates were. But I ended up connecting with some people who pointed me towards Eric Cressy, who I knew who he was. And so I reached out to him, and this was before he'd even started Cressy Sports Performance. And so basically he invited me down to like just meet him and observe. And ultimately, over time, I actually became like the first or second, that's still debated, intern. Was the first employee of Cressy Sports Performance many years ago. I'm showing my age with this story a little bit. But yeah, I started my career as a strength coach. I ended up going back to school for my master's and to be a dietitian after working with Eric for about 3 years.
So Eric, what I hear in that working with Eric was so bad that you had to get out of the field. Is that what I heard?
Yes, Eric, if you're listening. And actually, I'm still good friends with Eric. We still stay in touch. We still text regularly. So, no, we're on great terms.
Yeah, no, I say that because he might be listening.
What's that?
He might be listening. He's been on the show before, so I'm busting his chops. So.
Oh yeah, as you should. Like I always bust Eric's chops, and Eric's a great guy. And so like I was there when he met his wife. Like I've known Eric for what years? Really? 15? No, more than 15 years. Man, getting up there, my friend. 17 years. So basically, I had a great time. I loved that job. I had a really hard time leaving that job. But being a dietitian and having a larger nutrition focus was something I decided like I really wanted to pursue. My goal had actually been to open my own like Cressy Sports Performance type gym in like the Portland, Maine area, like roughly where I live now. With a larger focus on nutrition. And then, I had an opportunity with PN come up while I was in my master's program and went a different direction.
Yeah. I mean, so precision nutrition, like I'll show my age too. I first learned about precision nutrition back in, it was 2010 or 2011 when y'all put out the experiments in intermittent fasting, which is why it's so funny that like nowadays everybody's like, oh, intermittent fasting. And it's like that, this is not something new, everybody. Like Berardi put that out a while ago.
Yeah.
Like
over a dozen years ago. Yeah, definitely.
Exactly. And then like people nowadays are like, oh, I'm going to do this water only. And it's like Berardi literally did lay out some like, hey, you can kind of do that. Like it's not as, so I remember that. And then taking the precision nutrition course and the nutrition stuff, the reason I'm rambling about this is strength coaches understand that we play in the sandbox. We're not going to be the expert. Allocate out and have a great nutritionist, because the things that y'all are able to do and remember, like coaches that have been on, Pratik Patel, who worked in the NFL and college football as a dual role. Right now, Ryan Jackson that's doing it. Having other nutritionists on, Wendy Earlbeck. We just had Jessica Isaacs. We've had other ones that I apologize for not saying your name, but it is so impressive the work that you guys go through, but now you got to deal with social media nutritionists. Looking to expand your education further, but you don't want to pay the massive fees of going back to school? At Strength Coach Network, we have 2 long-form education courses that both cost less than one course taught to you by an online school. If you click down below to learn more about Fundamentals 1 or Fundamentals 2, you will be able to sign up for our education course that has over 20 hours of educational content brought to you by some of the biggest names in the field. Dr. Brian Mann, Zach Daycant, Jeff Moyer, Terrence Kennel, and many more inside of this course, all for less than the price of one course at a college university.
Yeah, that's kind of that's changed the ball game. I mean, it's a little bit different for me, like working for like a larger brand than if you are your own entity, right? If I was BSP coaching or something and I was just out there as myself only, that is a much more challenging world today because you're competing with, like, everyone's a content creator, right? 10, 12, 15 years ago, when people were really starting to like leverage blogging and their writing for websites or for magazines to like establish their expertise, a lot of those places would vet who you were and your qualifications and then, things of that nature. Now anyone can be perceived as an expert. And in some ways it's democratized the landscape, but in other ways it's allowed for a plethora of people who are underqualified and overconfident to give information and advice. And so that is definitely, it's a challenge we still even face at PN, right? Competing against these people because you just have a sea of them. Whereas before it was a much more constrained number, right? When it was just blogging pre-platforms, like social media like existed, but as like networks, right? Facebook was a way I connected with old high school friends, or my grandmother kept up to with my life, or whatever the case might be. Now people use those, they don't use them as network tools anymore. So they're used as platforms to create a brand, right? And to sell products. So it's definitely changed the landscape of how do you get in front of clients? How do you help ensure they're seeing like good material and not being swayed by things that might be problematic or dangerous, or even just going against what their actual long-term goals are?
I mean, you talk about brand, but Precision Nutrition has had a brand for a while. Like, everybody, you guys were doing this before anybody else was doing it. Like, kudos to PN for that.
Yeah, I mean, we've been coaching people in some way, shape, or form for just about 20 years at this point as a company. So we've coached, that's it, over 100,000 people. Like you were talking about, folks who worked in professional sports. Like I've worked in both ends of it. As a strength coach, I've consulted with professional sports teams, and like we've done pros, regular folks, Olympic athletes, teams, organizations, individual athletes. I worked with like Sloane Stevens and people like that. So we've coached, you name it. We've worked in the area. We've coached it. We've interacted with them. So it's definitely, we've been very fortunate in that regard, but the landscape has still changed and it's still impacted us as well.
What excites you to do what you do? Because I mean, it's not easy to do what you do, especially, consulting and working with those teams. Like what is your driving passion? What's your motivating factor and your why?
I mean, like as much as I do enjoy working with athletes and pro teams, what I actually think I take the most pleasure from is seeing clients have that aha moment of like light bulb going off of like in that fundamental shift in their, really it's more in their mindset, how they think about fueling themselves or eating, how they think about their health and well-being from these short-term like sprints and to like more of a viewing it more of like a long-term plan, viewing things more on a continuum and less on like this binary, I was good this weekend, I was bad this weekend, right? Getting people to help break some of those thought processes and these mindsets that actually hold them back. And when you see like those moments when things start to shift, that is so rewarding as a coach. And then additionally, like I get to help. A big part of my job is coaching other fitness professionals on how to do nutrition coaching. And so, I don't do it as much these days. I used to travel a lot and present and do tons of workshops and seminars. And I didn't enjoy the travel part, but I enjoyed the presenting part and like the teaching and helping young coaches have those same kind of moments from a coaching perspective, right? I would have like these slides that would show all the things that influence like food intake and health behaviors. And it was like, you'd see their jaws hit the floor, right? Because it's a whole multifactorial scene, right? It's not just any one thing that's driving people's behavior or their actions. And so when you'd show all these like areas of influence and all the interdependent nature of it, it was just, you saw like their head explode and realize like, oh, this is why just telling my client to have ice cream at night isn't actually stopping them from having ice cream at night, right? We have to have a deeper conversation as to what that's serving them and what purpose it might be providing. And so just seeing people have those kinds of aha moments, either clients or young coaches, is so rewarding on my end. So that's what really drives me these days.
How do you speed up that aha moment? Because I'm sure our coaches are listening out there like, how do I get my athletes to do this? Because I have them in person and I can't.
Well, I mean, I'll tell you what really was the biggest aha moment for me in my coaching. And it was actually, so someone I used to work with at PN, Dr. Krista Scott Dixon, was a huge influence on me, right? So like I had followed JB, Dr. John Berardi's work at PN for years. And then I came on board and she told me something that just like shook my coaching foundations to its core at the time. And it was, all behavior is an attempt to solve a problem. Ooh. So when you start looking at people's behaviors and actions through that lens, you're like, oh shit, right? Like, okay, so they're not drinking that 3 glasses of wine just because they don't give a shit, right? They're doing it because it's serving some purpose for them. It's trying to solve something for them, whether it's solving it well or not. It might be solving it well in the moment, but it's not a good long-term solution, right? So if we can find out what that is, we can then help them come up with better solutions. And it's not so much they have to like give up alcohol necessarily, but find healthier ways to cope or deal with whatever thing that's solving for them. And then all of a sudden, those other behaviors start to improve without you having to make it feel like they're being restricted from something that they enjoy, right? And so it just changes how you think about what people are doing and why. And then it can actually help them change because they don't necessarily realize this is why they're doing it, right? Clients aren't like consciously aware of, well, I'm doing X thing because of Y reason, right? There are so many subconscious decisions that we make. So if we can bring awareness to that for them too, all of a sudden they start to become more aware of their behaviors. Like, oh, I really do reach for X when Y happens, right? Or I isolate myself when Z happens, and then I become more stressed, and then I start eating more. All of a sudden they start to see these patterns and they create more awareness, and behavior changes just from that alone, right? And you can help them make better choices. Okay, now that we know this, what else could we do instead, right? There are infinite options, but just creating that awareness of your behaviors are an attempt to solve a problem can just be so eye-opening for people, for the client and for the coach, right? It changes your perspective as a coach. You now have more empathy for people because you realize they're not just self-sabotaging. It's providing something for them in the short term. And it helps clients realize the same thing because they often feel like they're self-sabotaging and they can't get out of their own way, right? So then they beat themselves up over it and it becomes this vicious cycle of like they feel guilt and shame over it. And then because they feel guilty and shamed, they do something else that relieves that guilt and shame. And it just becomes this vicious cycle. And so if we can instead break that by bringing awareness to it, and then hopefully now build a more virtuous cycle instead. Oh, when this happens, what's a productive thing we could do to help you deal with that? And they feel better about themselves. And then because they feel better about themselves, they choose other healthy behaviors. It becomes a virtuous cycle instead of a vicious cycle. And so that would be by far the biggest piece of advice. Nothing has changed my coaching more in the 20 years I've been in this field than that one particular line.
Hearing you say all of that, it made me realize from a conversation that we had with Ellen Davis last week, talking about food is almost therapy, comfort, it's culture, it's all three of these things rather than just nutrients that we're getting. How can you best explain that to our strength coaches and nutritionists and high performance managers that are listening to you right now?
I mean, I would say just take a step back and think about what we do with food, right? If we're going to have a gathering of people or a celebration, what does it include? food, right? And that's not just like a new thing. That's something that humans have done
Biblical.
throughout history.
Yeah, that's biblical.
Right? Because it's pre-biblical, right? It has been done for thousands, if not tens of thousands of years. Like sharing food, breaking bread, there's a communal aspect, there's a social connection aspect, there can absolutely be a cultural aspect if there are certain traditions and foods that are done at certain time periods, right? Or like, for example, like fasting during Ramadan, right? There are all of these elements at play when it comes into food, and keeping that in mind, right, is really helpful on an individual basis because food serves so many purposes for people. So if you are looking at it through that lens, you can realize that like it serves multiple jobs. Just like, okay, I like to equate things with like analogies or stories. Think about if you go to buy a car, right? You might think, okay, like, man, I really want to save money on it. And so fuel efficiency is really important to me. I want high miles per gallon. But if you need to tow things and haul things and move things around, you're not going to be buying a Prius, right? Like you need to, it has to do more than that one job for you, right? You might need a truck. Maybe you look for the most fuel efficient truck, right? But you're trying to combine multiple jobs into one thing. So it's not just, food is not just the Prius looking for the perfect mileage, right? It's also serving other purposes and other jobs, and keeping that in mind, keeping the cultural context in mind, keeping the fact that people use food to serve all kinds of other purposes, to solve other problems, to help them deal with shame and guilt, pain, right? Or there's also the pleasure component, right? To break bread with someone and to have a celebration, right? Those things are based around food. So you can try to fight that, or you can use it as an opportunity in coaching to help those be better choices there, or to be more reasonable in those circumstances. But if you're telling someone, not to do any of those things, you're just going to get ignored.
How do you then handle working with people that feel that way, but that they have these big gaps of nutritional needs because of those certain cultural, like, how do you go about addressing that? Because if you know that you have the information that they need to help their body achieve what they need to achieve, to do what they need to do, but they're resistant on that cultural level or family history level, whatever it is, how do you do that? Because it just seems so difficult. So kudos to you and everybody that can do that.
I mean, there are a couple different things, right? Like, first,
if you're looking to train your athletes in person or remote, you need to make sure that you're utilizing TeamBuildr. I have had TeamBuildr since 2019 and still utilize it with my remote athletes. This makes everything simple, from the ability to program, have videos right there, wellness questionnaires. Loved being able to have it in person at the rack at Towson, and being able to have it in person now at Goldfinch. This has made my life easier as a coach. If you're still printing on paper, I don't know what you're doing. If you have a different software company, again, I don't know what you're doing. Check out TeamBuildr down in the link below. Hawkin Dynamic is the best option if you're trying to get any force plate data, or if you're trying to collect any isometric mid-thigh pulls. Not only can you do isometric mid-thigh pulls for the lower body, but I call it an isometric mid-thigh pull for your upper body, where you're able to do an isometric push-up into something where your back is pushing into a bar and your hands are on the force plate. I utilized Hawkin's force plates and Hawkin's software when I was at Towson. Still utilize it now when I'm at Goldfinch. If you're using the other competitors, I don't know what you're doing. Hawkin's customer service is second to none. Hawkin's software and their hardware, again, second to none. Check them out in the link down below.
As a coach, I'd want to connect with them as a human being. Like, hey, why is this important to you, right? Because if you're only looking at them as essentially like numbers on a spreadsheet, you need to get these macronutrients in to get this, performance output. Humans don't necessarily, I mean, some humans work that way, but in general, most humans don't work that way. So it's like, hey, talk to me. Like, tell me what's so important about these things, right? Because here's what I think is important for you to reach your performance goals, right? Here's what we know will help. And these cultural or whatever the things are that are possibly getting in their way are really important to you on a personal level or a family level, which is great, right? Like, I want you to have a rich and fulfilling life outside of just the performance. However, right, my job is also to help you with the performance. So how can we marry those two things, right? Like, let's look at it together and see, like, okay, this is super important to you for these purposes. And we know this is important to you for your performance purposes. And how can we marry those two things? Maybe not perfectly, but as a start, right? Like, let's say, for example, they need to be eating 200 grams of protein a day and they're eating 110, right? For whatever reason. Like the goal isn't necessarily to immediately get them to 200, especially if they're resistant to the concept. It's like, hey, can we treat it as an experiment? Why don't we just go for like 140? And I'm just throwing numbers out there, right? There are many different ways to do this.
Yep.
Why don't we just go for 140 for a week or two and see how it goes, right? You can come back to me and let me know how that's working for you, like performance wise, recovery wise, if it's impacting you negatively in the things that are important to you, like the cultural things, considerations, or whatever the case might be. So we treat things as experiments. So they feel like they can be changed, even though we know they can be changed anytime. To the client, it can often feel like, well, now I have to do this new thing, and it's going to be this new thing forever, right? As opposed to like, hey, we're trialing things out, right? It's like a training program. If I put someone on a training program and some exercise is really pissing something off, we can modify the exercise. We know this as professionals. Clients don't always realize this, right? In the same way. They don't have the same mindset because they don't have the same framework and perspective on the big picture. So we treat things as a test, as an experiment. Hey, let's try this for a couple of weeks, right? You can let me know how it's going, how it's impacting you here, and here, right? And then we can reassess and reevaluate if we want to try and test it more or pivot or try it in a different way, right? Whatever the case might be. And so that's often how you help break down barriers, is helping people view it as like they have autonomy. They have the capacity to change that at any time. And we can see how it's actually working for them. So we're gathering data about how it's working for them in their real life through multiple different measures that are important to them. And then we can sit down together and look at it and be like, hey, like I see this, your body composition's improved, like your performance metrics in the gym have improved. How's it working for you on those other things that were important to you? And they might say, hey, you know what? At first it was a little weird, but I got kind of used to it and it's been no big deal. Like, hey, cool. If we keep it as it is for now, maybe we try and increase it again, right? Maybe we go from 140 to 170, like one other portion of protein a day, 1 scoop of protein powder, 1 cup of Greek yogurt. It doesn't take a whole lot to make some of those jumps, right? So we treat it again as another experiment. So that's one of the ways I find to be super effective, because it makes people feel like they have the power to implement it and we have the power to change it at any time. It doesn't feel like me dictating, hey, you need to do this thing. Because if it's just me telling someone what to do and if they're ambivalent about it or resistant about it, they're going to push back, right? That's somewhat human nature. So how can we, like we talk about it in coaching or in motivational interviewing, like bring the boats alongside, right? We're instead of trying to drag you, I'm pulling up alongside you and we're moving forward together. So you want to make people feel like you're there beside them, walking with them, as opposed to trying to drag them behind you, because then they're going to resist that and they're going to fight that. So that's one of the most important ways, one of the most helpful ways I find that to work.
Do you ever find any hurdles when you are starting to help people increase, like you said, that 140 to 170? Do you feel that people then start to switch into that mindset of now they're eating macros instead of eating food? Because I remember that being something you guys talk about in the text.
So that was just me giving an example.
And I'm not trying to I'm not saying that you did anything wrong. I'm saying because people will start to be like, oh, I need my turkey. Like instead of being like, oh, I'm eating this turkey with my family. Like, oh, where's my protein with this? And I'm not eating that apple because it has carbs. Like where instead of eating food, and they're worried about the macro instead of what they're actually eating.
Yes, that is definitely something we see. It's so. The way we tend to use, like if we use macro tracking with a client, is we try to do it as a generally like short-term approach where we can increase awareness, because oftentimes people aren't necessarily aware of what's in things, right? They go to Starbucks, they get a caramel latte and they're like, they don't realize it had 300 calories plus, right? So there's oftentimes we just don't know what we don't know. So that's where tracking can sometimes be eye-opening for people. Like, holy shit, I didn't realize this had so many calories. Or I didn't realize that was such a good protein source. So I thought bagels had more protein in them. Like, I can't tell you how many times I've worked with athletes and they think peanut butter is a good protein source. Right? Like, it's it never goes away. It's like a thing that won't die. Right? And so I'm like, okay, even if looking at the label doesn't quite convince them in the same way that when they're adding things up for the day when they're tracking, they're like, oh my God, it just didn't give me nearly as much as I thought. And so that's where tracking can be helpful. It's when people get trapped in, they can only eat by tracking. Like they don't know what to do if they're not tracking. Like if you can't eat food without tracking your intake, like that's become a totally different story. So we try to use it short term. We teach at PN, we teach like hand portions. It's like your palm, the diameter and the thickness of your palm is for protein portions. Your fist is for vegetables, your cupped hand for carbohydrates, and your entire thumb for fats. And so that's another tool we have. So we try to use multiple different tools, right? Depending on what's best for the client, what they're most comfortable with. Oftentimes people might start with macro tracking and then transition to hand portions because they're accurate enough, not quite as accurate as macro tracking, right? But especially when someone's done macro tracking for a few weeks, okay, they've built awareness, they understand what's in what, they've already been weighing and measuring things, and they can see how big they are and what gives them what. Like they can pretty easily transition to using their hands to now track their intake and track their portions. And it's still counting the macros for them. It's still very, very close without having to do all that math or get over bogged down in like, oh, I can't have that because of this. And I got to make sure I'm at exactly 175 grams. Like, well, honestly, you're actually probably not at exactly 175 grams because even those labels are like there's plus or minus, right? Like there's a margin of error. And so it's really about your intake over time, right? If you're at 170 one day and 180 the next day, you're still at 175 grams, right, as your average. So it's not seeing enough detail, but not getting so bogged down in the detail that you can't move forward and see the big picture, right? So, there's that saying, like the devil's in the details. Like, yes, it is, but you also don't want to miss the forest for the trees. And for most people, most of the time, I'd much rather they see the forest and get the big picture and the big rocks in place. And some of the little details can be great, but they're far, far less important than having the big rocks consistently in place and just having that big picture. That's what's going to make the biggest improvements for people. So, we try to be very mindful of how we use macro tracking.
One of the notes that I wrote down when you were talking there is, how do you then fix the individual while hearing the issues that they're talking to you about without going on autopilot? Because if let's say I was your client and you're like, all right, I hear what Justin's saying. Like they're presenting based off of your 17 years of experience. You're like, all right, based off of his XYZ, chances are he has this. How do you not go into that autopilot and still hear me for me, but use your base of knowledge to help me?
I force myself, right? Like, I remind myself before every client session that, like, if I was thinking about this, if this was a good friend of mine, right? Like, or you just try to do anything you can to remind yourself this is a human being, right? Who has their own wants and needs and emotions and desires. And like, you have to think about, like, yes, as a coach, I need to keep in mind like the big universal principles that apply to everybody, right? We're all the same, but yet we're all different because we have different circumstances and preferences and schedules and, right? Like my needs 7 years ago when my kids were all a lot younger, my life circumstances were different. Now my kids are a little bit older. They're more self-sufficient. Like it's changed the demands on me. We all have different demands and different resources and different supports. So I always try to keep that in mind. And I ask about those things because then it helps me keep it top of mind. Like, what does your schedule look like? Right. I want to know like what the demands are in their time. I want to have an idea of what kind of social support and support systems they have at home.
Yep.
So that helps, like, it doesn't just help it keep front and center. It just reminds me over and over again of all the little differences that we all face. And then how can we apply those universal principles in the context of this person's individual life, right? Which has its own idiosyncrasies different from mine. And so whether they're, the one thing that I see a lot of coaches do is try and get people to eat like them, right?
Ooh,
like,
yeah.
And what I try and remind most coaches is most of our clients are not us, right? They don't show up at seminars or listen to podcasts about coaching or about, they might listen to podcasts about eating and nutrition, but they certainly don't go to seminars from me to hear about, nutrition and exercise and those kinds of things. So oftentimes they want to eat better and move more or whatever in service of something different, right? They're not doing it just to be better at lifting, right? Like when I was younger, I lifted just to be better at lifting. I wasn't training for anything else in particular necessarily. Most of our clients aren't doing that, right? So they're eating better and exercising to serve other purposes in their life. And so it's keeping those kinds of things in mind and understanding and finding out what those things are can help make sure that you are focusing on the individual in front of you as opposed to the quote unquote average.
Anybody that was hearing him talk about like the social support, that instantly triggered me from the questions that as a student of y'all that came with the book, like those intake questions had been huge for me with my athletes, being able to get an idea of like what their dorm looks like, what their family history was like. I mean, it was unbelievable. And like I said, to think that those were all resources that I got, 12 years ago, like so impressive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's well, I mean, we also learn from our mistakes, right? We've been doing this a long time, so we've been able to screw up plenty and learn from it and see how to make it better. I mean, failure is a great teacher, So when you've been doing it a long time, and we look at the best research, and I think it's partly what makes us unique as a company is not only do we certify people, not only do we coach people, we do both of those things. So we learn about the best coaching practices and things for our certification, but when we apply those in our own coaching and we see how they work with real people in the real world, as opposed to just in research studies, right? So then we get to see, okay, here's how we saw it work. And then we feed that back into our certification. And so it becomes like a feedback loop where we look at the best evidence and we look at the best research, but then we apply those things with our own clients and then we see how it all works, right? So it becomes this circular like feedback loop, which then improves our own coaching, improves our certifications, and we think it helps make them both better, faster because of that.
Within the certification, this is a topic that gets talked about, but I want to touch on it and kind of hear your opinion on how strength coaches can best handle disordered eating, where it goes from somebody's just kind of talking about their nutrition with their strength coach and he's trying to help out, give general recommendations, to, okay, a strength coach is starting to hear things, or even a nutritionist, because we have some that listen to this stuff too. Like, what's best practices to then be able to still keep the trust of the athlete who is now vulnerable enough to tell you the thing, but then to actually then help get them the help that they need, not only just as an athlete, but as a human being, because like you said, we have to remember they're a human first.
I mean, I think there are a couple different things, and I try to put it in like buckets, like a scope of practice, like a series of buckets. So there are the things you can always help with, like helping them, apply the fundamental principles of good nutrition, right? Eating whole foods, protein, fruits and vegetables, those kinds of things. And there are the things that are like outside your scope, which are like they're telling you about like some serious family trauma, or right, they have showing signs of depression, things like that are things you'd have to refer. But then there's a huge gray area in the middle, right? These are things I can help you notice. So if someone's starting to show signs of like disordered eating, but not necessarily an eating disorder, right? That would be diagnosed like anorexia, bulimia, those kinds of things. But just like some abnormal relationships with food, which frankly, many, I'd actually argue the majority of Americans struggle with some form of disordered eating and an unhealthy relationship with food. So this is incredibly common. So how can you help people recognize and notice these things in a way that doesn't feel like offensive, but you can show how there's a gap between what they're doing now and where they want to be, and how it's impacting their ability to make progress or reach their goals. And so if someone's showing signs of like disordered eating, let's say they have like all or nothing thinking about food, or they tend to look at things from like they moralize their food choices, right? We see that a lot. I was good. I was bad this weekend. Like, okay, well, eating some cookies doesn't make you bad, right? Like we're trying to separate out some of that talk, because it ends up creating that like vicious cycle kind of component. So one, we make them more aware of it, right? We draw attention to it or awareness of it. Like, hey, have you noticed, you do this a lot where you put this label on yourself. And so we just want to make people aware of some of those things in a non-judgmental way. Because again, like as I alluded to earlier, like just bringing awareness is such a massively powerful tool. Because then people become aware of those things instead of it just being like automatic autopilot, this kind of talk. It's like, oh, well, shit, no, I never thought of it that way. Right. So we try to bring awareness to that kind of stuff and then play with it. Like, hey, now that you notice that, like, what if we don't think about food this way? How would you think about food like on a continuum? If that was the worst choice you could have made, what could have been just like a little bit better? right? So we're just trying to change their mindset and their thinking about these kinds of things to help bring them to a healthier place with food where, yes, they want to eat well and support their performance and support their health and well-being, but they also want to like break bread with friends and with loved ones. And I don't want to say like, I mean, bring some joy to eating. Like eating food can be a joyous occasion. Yeah. Now that can become a slippery slope. People are like, yeah, well, I had 6 beers and that was awesome. You know, like, okay, like that. There's a time and a place for that too. But you know, you want to help people find that balance of eating really well for performance goals or aesthetic goals, but also bringing joy and pleasure to food and the social connection it can provide. So one of the ways we do that is by helping them notice and become aware of some of those behaviors or patterns or like statements and thought processes that they have, and then help them just kind of unpack it a little bit, right? Like oftentimes people are completely unaware of these kinds of things, or they're like semi-aware of it. Like they know they do a certain thing, but they don't really know why. And it's not fully clear to them the connection on these things. And so not that you're going to say like, hey, I noticed that you suffer from disordered eating, right? You're not going to like put a label on it and say it like that, but you can just say, hey, have you ever noticed, right? Like whenever you feel like you don't eat so well on the weekends, you say this thing, like you say, I was bad or I was good. Like, and that strikes me because, right, and you can give examples. So you can talk about how, in my experience, people put like moral labels on food. It makes it actually really hard to eat well consistently because we're always judging ourselves about when I do it this way, I was bad. I do it this way, I was good, rather than putting it in a big picture and realizing like, it's not about perfection. Eating well 80% of the time is just as effective as eating well 90 or 100%, right? So it's helping people see that bigger picture and not beat themselves up and have that self-flagellation over small mistakes and then judge themselves for it and then feel guilty about it, right? So those are the things we're trying to do. Those are the types of disordered eating we're trying to help people recognize and deal with by bringing their attention to it, by helping them notice it. Now, if it starts going down into the realm of like starving themselves or orthorexia or bulimia or things of that nature, if you consistently see that kind of behavior or you suspect that kind of behavior, that's where you might want to make a referral to a qualified professional. So I know it was a really long-winded answer, but hopefully that got what you were looking for.
No, it did. And then it made me have this question that I wrote down within that realm. What about the athletes that then like they start already saying it like, okay, hey coach, I already know I eat like a child. I eat pizza, burger, fries. I don't eat a lot, but I only eat this. Like I can't lose weight. I'm only eating 1 or 2 meals. But and then you start to, talk with them and work with them. And you start to find out that these are the things that they're eating because some of these kids may be coming in from, that's what they grew up with, the culturalness of it. Where do you start with someone like that?
You need CEUs to remain certified. At Strength Coach Network, both of our long-form education courses, Fundamentals 1 and Fundamentals 2, both have 2.0 CEUs to the NSCA in Category C. When you complete the learning and you complete the learning check, you will earn your 2.0 CEUs. That is 33% of the CEUs you need in a 3-year reporting period. Click the link down below to learn more about both courses. Velocity-based training is important to use with your athletes. However, you want to make sure you're using VBT at the right time with the right athletes. That's why you need to get in touch with the folks at Vitruve. At Vitruve, they're going to be able to help you with the proper tools to monitor VBT, but they're also going to be able to make sure that you're using it properly. It is often misunderstood, and that is why the folks at Vitruve will make sure that the tools that you use from them are accurate and they're reliable, but also making sure that you're implementing it with the right athletes. Check out Vitruve in the link down below.
Oftentimes you see that when like they don't have other cooking skills, right?
Ooh.
So they were never like taught to, but they just they've never tried it. So they don't even have the belief that they're capable of doing it. And so one of the things, again, I treat it as an experiment. Hey, why don't we try making, like we come up with a meal that they might, we think will be pretty good for them, but it's pretty low level. Like, hey, maybe we just make some scrambled eggs, right? Or whatever the case might be. Start small, make some scrambled eggs and have some toast and fruit with it, right? Doesn't require a whole lot of skill, but they've never even cooked themselves scrambled eggs. So we might start something there. And then we might progress to like grilling something, or we might progress to like baking some chicken in a pan, because you can set a very specific time for it. It doesn't require a whole lot of like subjective. So we start with some small things like that, not only because it's building some cooking skills. That's a piece of it. The bigger piece is actually helping to build their confidence and their belief
too.
that they can actually do it, right? Because then that ends up leading to them being willing and able to try a whole bunch of other things, because they create these like self-limiting beliefs, right? Like, oh, I eat like a child. So that's how they actually identify. I identify as someone who eats like a child, and a child will only do X, Y, and Z things, period. Right? So we try and change how they think about themselves so they can change how they actually act, because our actions flow from our identities. So if you really self-constrain like that, it then really limits what you think you're able to do when you're actually, frankly, so much more capable of that. And I'm not expecting someone to be a Michelin chef, right? I don't cook 5-star meals, right? But they're good enough, and they're tasty enough, and they're nutritious enough. So it's not about creating that type of perfection and trying to get people away from that thinking. Like, you don't have to be cooking these fancy ass meals you might see on Instagram, right? Or wherever, Pinterest or wherever. But can we get you just making one step there and see how that goes? Can we make a super shake, right? Where you put some stuff in a blender and blend it. And even that, some people are like blown away. Like, wow, and it was really good. Tasted really good. And I felt so good about myself. I had protein, I had fruits, I had vegetables, right? Like, I have healthy fats in there. So it tastes good. They feel good about themselves, and it didn't really require a whole lot of skill. You put stuff in a blender and you hit a button, right? But it helps boost their confidence. It's something new. It's outside their comfort zone, and it was healthier than most things they normally eat, right? So those are the kinds of things we help them try to do, is expand their belief in themselves. And then you'll see the eating change as a result of that. So too often, I think coaches try to focus on like the mechanics of something, and then not see like what's the thing behind the thing, right? Like, let's back it up a little further and look at like what's actually holding them back, right? It's, yes, it's cooking skills, but it's actually probably like a belief in their ability to cook things. So if we can change that, they'll be much more willing to try new cooking things and build those skills more readily.
What about the athlete that is not eating and they're like, oh, but I'm taking this supplement, or the supplement happy athlete? Because I know I've come across those, and I'm assuming that our listeners are having the same issue. Where do you start with that athlete that's like, oh, I love supplements, I need supplements, or like, oh, I'm scared of supplements? What is your, and I know Precision Nutrition, you guys had the core supplements that you recommend back when I went through the course. Mm-hmm. What is your thoughts on all of that now?
I mean, my question would be, how's that working for you? All right, if you're taking a crap load of supplements but not necessarily meeting all of your nutritional needs through food, like, because we've all seen that the person who thinks what they are doing should be working, right, but it's not necessarily working, right? Like, oh, they go to the gym over and over again and they've looked the same for 2 years.
How's that working? That's
right?
Power. So, there's power in that.
It is a very powerful question, so long as you ask it in a non-snarky, non-judgmental, right? Because it can definitely come across the wrong way if you're like, yeah, how's that working for you, right? As opposed to, well, how's that working for you? And so we even have like a form which didn't exist when you went through the course, but it has a very stuffy title, like the diet satisfaction assessment. But really, it's that question, how's that working for you, quantified. So it asks like how this approach or this way of eating is working for you through multiple different like dimensions, performance-wise, energy-wise, aesthetic-wise. Like, it has all these different questions to help people truly evaluate how something's working for them in all kinds of different areas of their life, as opposed to, we can get very focused on, well, I'm taking all these things to help me do X, Y, and Z, right? Like, it's very narrow, but it can come at the cost of all these other areas. So like, yes, maybe it is helping me here, but it's actually detrimental here, 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 and here. Or maybe they're taking all those supplements and eating plenty and are getting results, but they would be getting those same results with or without all those supplements. And that's a different conversation. And so then I might prod at some of them a little bit, like, well, what do you think this is, providing you? And, if they give good answers, or if they're, just spouting like supplement talking points to me, we might unpack some of that. But you do need to be careful of. So the way I think about this is like, is this likely causing harm or taking them backwards? If it's not, I kind of like poke at it over time as opposed to try and just chopping it off, because they've built up oftentimes like an attachment to these kinds of things. And if not, if they're just like, well, I thought that would be good, I'm okay stopping that, great. But if they're not, if they're like, no, like this is doing this, this, and this for me, it's like, okay, cool. Like, well, we're going to leave that alone for now, as so long as I feel like it's not causing them harm, or they're taking something from like a shady company, or it's not like third party tested or verified. Then it's like, okay, well, what if we try this version of it? I might try and like slowly educate them over time, like in ways that would be helpful, and get them to almost create some doubt in their need for all those things. But it all depends on like how ready, willing, and able they are to adjust all those supplements that they're taking, right? And so some of the ways I'll do it is by asking how that's working for them, by asking like what they think it's providing for them. If they'd be willing to try without it, we can do that as an experiment too. Hey, what if you try 2 weeks without that supplement and we see what happens, or a month, right? And we try and see what happens. And then let's say they do it. Okay, I'll try not having my pre-workout for a month and having coffee instead, or whatever the thing might be. And we see how that's working for them, right? And so sometimes like, nope, I need to bring that back. Other times they're like, yeah, I noticed nothing changed, right? Taking a break from that supplement. So we play with things like that to experiment with how well it's working for them, and my approach all depends on how attached they are to all those supplements, like how dug in they are and how strong of a relationship I have with that athlete. If I've known them for quite a while and we have a strong relationship, I'm more willing to be a little more direct, because we have already built that trust. So they understand my expertise and how I'm looking out for them. If it's someone that's very new to me, we don't have that yet. So I'm a little bit more cautious because I don't want to push them away. And then now I'm tuned out and I have to take a long time to get back into that circle of trust. Right. So I want to build that relationship and that trust first, and then we can work on some of those things.
That's, I'm glad you hit that nail on the head, because your answers are continuing to drive that home. And these are things that I wish I would have had that conversation and heard. So anybody that's listening to that, make sure like how's that working for you, and not in the snarky way. Like that's really, really good. And it's simple, but like, dang, that's good, man.
And it requires them to self-reflect, right?
Yes,
Instead of just living in the shoulds. Well, this should work for me, so therefore I'm going to do it. It's like, okay, well, how is it working for you? Right? Whether it should or should not, what is it actually doing for you right now? How is it working for you? And so that's how you can evaluate so many things. And it's a hugely powerful, because it just creates some of that self-reflection, particularly, again, if you ask it in a very non-judgmental way. And if you can make clear, it's like, well, how's it working for you for your performance? How's it working for you, with your partner? How's it working for you, X, Y, and Z, all these different ways you can ask that question.
An off-topic question that I wrote down is, where did the notion of the 30 gram of protein being digested come from? And like, I know that there's a lot of strength coaches out there that specifically work in football with large human beings, that they've had that conversation with their nutritionist or dietitian on staff, that they're like, oh, well, you can only have 30 grams of protein every, 3 hours. Like that's like, how do you address that?
It's a fascinating thing. Like I'd say there's some debate as to where it came from. It's likely one of those things like, where did drinking 8 glasses of water a day come from? It's kind of like this nebulous thing that just kind of like became a rule of thumb. And there's some evidence to support it. Like there's some evidence showing like, oh, and once you exceed 30 grams, like muscle protein synthesis doesn't continue to increase. But that's not true in all scenarios. It's especially not true in larger individuals. It's especially not true when you're undergoing really intense training. So like for my mom, exercising 3 times a week, sure. But even then, it's not entirely true. Like it's not just going to go to waste. Your body doesn't just go, oh, you had 40 grams? Well, those other 10 grams can just piss off. Like it's just, your body's not doing that. It's trying to be as efficient as possible. So it might use them for different purposes, or there's a limit to like a point of diminishing returns, or doesn't increase as much, but it's still not going to be wasted. It's not like you just don't digest it and absorb it. So if you have 200 plus, 250, 300 plus pound football players, and you're trying to just only have 30 grams of protein at a time. Well, how many meals are you going to have to eat a day to get in like the 1.6 to 2.2 grams per kilogram of protein that we need, right, to support their training and their recovery, right, or to build more muscle. That would take an inordinate amount of meals, 7, 8, I mean, up to 10 plus meals a day. Like that's just logistically impossible. And so, that's what I find so interesting. It's like you can't square that with the long-term data that shows people need larger amounts of total protein. So some of these acute studies that look at like short-term outcomes like muscle protein synthesis or whatever, like, okay, how does that square with what we know builds muscle over time? And that research says people need, basically 3/4 to 1 gram of protein per pound of body weight to maximize like muscular growth and development or improve recovery, or sometimes even higher amounts than that. So we know those things on chronic long-term muscle growth. So those short-term studies are interesting, but if they don't square with what we know on long-term muscle growth, they're just looking at like things we think lead to muscle growth, as opposed to, so what we call like soft outcomes versus hard outcomes. And the hard outcomes are the things that matter most, right? Because that's actual studies on actual muscle gained or lost, as opposed to really acute studies that look at changes in muscle protein synthesis over 12 hours, which are interesting, but don't tell us what's going to actually happen over the long term. So if they don't square, I tend to, I don't want to say ignore the short-term stuff. I just don't put as much weight into it because it doesn't line up with what we know works over time toward the actual outcomes that we're looking for. That is much stronger data. So, the 30 grams per meal thing it's not true. I understand where some of it came from, and it's one of those things that just seems like stuck around. And if you're not marinating in the protein research, you don't realize how the protein world has moved beyond that. But if you learned that 10 years ago, when that was the kind of prevailing thought to some degree, it can stick around in people's minds, right? And unless you're living in this world like I am, it's easy to not realize that that's no longer the case. And what really matters is our chronic long-term intake over time. And so, right, whether it's 60 grams at a meal or 30 grams at a meal, or right, it's really dependent on how much you need over the course of a day or over the course of really weeks, and broken up into a way that's relatively even and that fits your schedule and your needs and your preferences. So I would just say, like, if you're getting pushback, let's say you're a strength coach and you're getting pushback on your team's nutritionist on eating more than 30 grams in a meal, I would ask them how that squares with what we know about the requirements for athletes to eat for total protein intake, and how that would even be possible for a 300 or 250 pound athlete to do that. Like, how many meals per day would they have to eat? Like, think of the logistics of that. And like, you just can't square the math. So, that's one way I would do it. And I'd also bring to the table like the newer studies that show that's not quite the case, right? There was one that was just done with 100 grams and showed that muscle protein synthesis was still increasing even at that level. And it's some of it's dependent upon the population and the timing and how much training they've done and what have you. But it just helps to break the idea that 30 is this universal number that applies across the board to all people at all times.
Are you expanding and need more equipment inside your current room? Or are you building a new weight room and you need to get some equipment? You need to look no further than Powerlift. I had Powerlift equipment when I was at Harvard, Iowa, and at the University of Maryland. I'm currently utilizing their stuff right now. I'm telling you, Powerlift strong, Powerlift made here in America, here in the great state of Iowa, made, manufactured. You have the ability for customization, whether it's on the bench, whether it's on the upholstery, whether it's on the bumpers, across the rack. There are countless options, making sure it's designed to your specific brand. It's Powerlift made, it's Powerlift strong, it's not cheap like all the other competitors, and the people inside of Powerlift are people that you want to be with. Check them out in the link down below. Are you or your athletes waking up too hot or too cold in the middle of the night? Or are you looking for a sleep tracker option that doesn't involve wearing a ring or a wrist or a watch, something on your body? Then you need to look no further than the company Sleepme. Sleepme makes Chilipads, which keep your bed cold or warm depending on what you want. And they also have a tracker that will go underneath that pad so it will be able to tell how well you slept. When I did a little study on myself with the Oura Ring and with the Sleepme tracker, they were within 97% of each other, and it was actually pretty astonishing how similar the two were. I love my Chilipad. It makes me sleep great. I sleep cold. I actually wake up cold now. I haven't woke up warm in pretty much ever since I've had it. I don't like sleeping on the road because I don't have the ability to use my Chilipad. Bunch of former colleagues back at Towson got it. My stepmother got it. Check it out in the link down below.
Speaking of math, you had and new stuff, new research. Has there anything changed in terms of like what would you say is the best practice for body comp? Whether like what's the gold standard? Has it changed? And then what is best practice for mass adoption for teams to do body comp assessment?
So like for when you asked the first question, you mean like to change body comp?
No, like to actually assess it. Like before, so if you're going to try to help change people, you want to know their pre and post. So if you're like, if you wanted to say, hey, even if it's a remote or an in-person client that you have, are you telling them, hey, go bod pod, go DEXA? If you're going to get a skin caliper, make sure you get somebody that has X certification for the skin calipers, so you have a good inter-rater reliability and whatnot.
So I have like two different answers here. Like, well, actually probably three. The gold standard is probably still DEXA or even like potentially functional MRI. But those are so like inaccessible to most populations that I don't tend to like push them. So now they have better like bod pods or even like the like in-body type stuff where you're doing bioelectrical impedance, but through two areas, through their feet and through the hands, as opposed to the old school ones that were like just through the feet or just through the hands. Having it through two like connection points, or really four, at the same time significantly improves the like accuracy and precision of bioelectrical impedance. So those have gotten a lot better. In the grand scheme of things, so here's my second part of this answer. I'm less concerned about the exact measurement approach you use and more concerned about just using the same one in the same way so that we can track progress. So whether someone's 15% body fat according to DEXA or 16.5 according to BIA or 14.2 according to BodPod, fundamentally, unless you're a bodybuilder like getting paid for how you look or a model getting paid for how you look, I know there are some like pro teams or organizations that have requirements for athletes at certain positions.
Yeah,
but
that's a good point.
If I put that aside for a minute, what matters most to me is you use the same measurement tool in the same way at the same time so that we can be sure it's quite precise. And then now how can we see changes in our body composition relative to that? Because the exact accuracy to me is less important than the trends we're looking to get. Okay, they measured at 17 and we really want them at 12. Like, it's likely it was accurate enough where they're not at 12, right? Even if they did DEXA or a functional MRI, they're not at 12. But can we see progress towards that? So ultimately, like, that's the thing I'm most interested in as a coach. And I know there can be like administrative hoops to jump through or bureaucratic hoops to jump through when teams have certain requirements for certain positions. But on the whole, like if I put that aside for right now, I'm just looking for a consistent way to measure it, and then I can measure progress and changes over time. Whether it's exactly 17 or exactly 15 isn't as relevant to me, because even the gold standard ones, like even DEXA, can under and overestimate in certain populations. So there isn't one, other than an autopsy, there isn't one perfect way to measure your body composition.
That's what Jennifer. So the reason I'm laughing is we had Jen Gibson, who now works with the Blackhawks. She's like, murder is your gold standard. She's like, no, I don't want people going out there killing people. She's like, but that is your only gold standard.
It's true. It is the only 100% accurate way to measure body composition, because we are limited by the tools that we have. And that's okay, so long as we don't put so much weight in those tools that we think, okay, a player's got to be at 15% body fat, because that's what the research shows is ideal for this position. Like, yes, it shows that on average, right? But even within that, there's going to be a standard distribution curve of some sort, like a bell curve where there's a standard distribution of, really, it's like 17 to 13 is ideal. And on average, it's 15. But if you're in that range, I'm obviously making up numbers.
Yeah.
But if you're in that range, you are in where you need to be, right? To maximally improve your performance or to display your athleticism or whatever the case might be. And so too often I see people get a little too enamored with like averages and then don't look at the actual human in front of them.
That's a good point. One of the last questions I have here before I want to let you go to respect your time. I had a coach and an administrator one time tell me that mass gainer was a food and fish oil was a supplement, and they wouldn't stick to the fact that mass gainer was an actual supplement. Can you help either me wrap my head around that and any of our coaches that might have to deal with that too?
I mean, I don't even know how to take that. So mass gainer, which is likely a relatively cheap protein and lots of cheap carbohydrates, highly refined, thrown in there, and usually some cheap, highly refined fats as well. But fish oil is not. I cannot help you wrap your head around that. To me, they're both supplements.
Yes, right? They're both supplements.
So, I mean, I could see someone making an argument for like, whey protein as like a food, since it's, like an offshoot of like cheese production, but it's so processed.
It's also not governed by the FDA. So it's not a supplement. Like it's a supplement. Like
right. Exactly. It's not sold. And actually, if you look at the FDA, it's not sold as a food. It has different requirements and regulations. But I could at least see like someone trying to make an argument for that. I would still push back on it a little bit. But a mass gainer, like that's taking it to a whole nother level. So yeah, I got nothing for them there. Like, yeah, they're just wrong.
Thank you for that. Precision Nutrition 1, I took it. Precision Nutrition 2, Will Greenberg is now with the Buffalo Bills. He was at Southern Utah when he and I were talking, and he talked to me about how unbelievable 365 day. It's awesome. I'm teasing it. Anybody that wants to get better in nutrition, I couldn't recommend it more. Can you talk about it a little bit more for coaches that are interested in it? They want to expand their continuing ed in nutrition. What does it look like now? Because like I said, I've had it and learned from y'all for years, but you've obviously updated and things have changed for the better.
Sure. I mean, ultimately we have multiple options. So we have like our level 1 nutrition certification, which is what you took 12 years ago, which is now in its 4th edition. You probably took the 2nd edition. So that's that's really meant to give you like your fundamentals in nutrition coaching. We cover nutrition science, we cover nutrition coaching and how those two intersect and how to leverage behavior change theories into your coaching, right? So it's really like, here's what to do and how to do it. We also have a whole certification, advanced certificate, we call it, on coaching athletes in particular. So very, very, very specific to the athletic realm and less like as broad-based as the level 1 nutrition certification is. So that's newer. That's only like a year or two old, a couple of years old. And it has 3 different courses. It's awesome. It goes through like coaching athletes big picture, and then it gets more in like narrows the scope each time. Like here's how to like personalize for athletes. Here's how to troubleshoot for athletes. So it really is specific to like determining macronutrient needs, all the things that you see pop up in athletic realms a lot more than like general population, the time demands they have, the training demands they have. And then we have our level 2 certification, which is in many ways an entirely different animal because it's paced. Like you have to be in person, and it's, as we cover nutrition stuff in there, but it's much more about how to communicate. So it really covers a lot of the things you've heard me talk about, like how's that working for you? How we talk about all behaviors in an attempt to solve a problem. Because as much as we think about, like I'm a dietitian by training. And so I learned a lot about nutrition. Even before I became a dietitian, I was actually studying to be an engineer. So like math and that kind of stuff is how my brain works, right? So like macronutrients and math and like the biochemistry of it all, like that, I get that. That's just how my brain is wired. Learning how to connect as a human to another human, which then facilitates change, was what took the most work for me as a coach, because it's not where my background was in. But that's what makes the biggest difference, right? You can know all the, just like in training, you can know all of the stuff about making the best training program, but if you go out there to coach your athletes and you're not connecting with them and you're not inspiring them and you're not getting them to feel like you are bought into them as people, your programs aren't going to work as well, right? So that's what level 2 teaches, is how to communicate, how to connect, how to build that relationship so that you can actually help them make the change they're looking to make, because you've now created a connection there where they're ready, willing, and able to trust you and implement your recommendations. And they're willing to, like the best coaches or the best teachers, people would talk about, they would run through a brick wall for that person, right? That's the kind of connection you want to have. That's the kind of coach you want to be, because that's how you get people to make the changes for themselves that'll lead to their best outcomes. All the knowledge in the world doesn't matter if you can't connect with someone on a human level, get them to do those things. So that's what level 2 does. That's what we teach in level 2, much more than anything else is. I mean, we teach more nutrition stuff in there, don't get me wrong, but it is about communicating and connecting with those things to help all those recommendations take place.
Anybody that just heard that, I got a conversation with my buddy Colin Francis, who's former athletic trainer with the Baltimore Ravens. He's now he's the assistant athletic director for sports performance, and he and I were talking about how, like, you know, getting your PN, it doesn't now make you the nutritionist as an athletic trainer or strength coach, but it now helps you have a base level of knowledge to have an educated conversation with the expert in the domain. Because if you don't even understand basal metabolic rates and certain terminology, you can't have an intellectual conversation with that person. The same way an AT or a nutritionist that gets their CSCS, no, they don't know how to run a weight room and run a weightlifting session, but it helps them have a fundamental level of knowledge to have a great conversation, to build collaboration and working with your strength coach. So that's why I got my PN1, not to be able to replace the nutritionist, but to show, hey, I'm here to I know the base knowledge. Let me learn from you further. And so that's why, you know, me and Colin, we think so highly of everything at Precision Nutrition.
Well, I appreciate that. And I couldn't agree more. I mean, if you can expand your knowledge base like that, not only do you like learn more, but now that expert in that domain, right, is going to see that, right? Now you're going to be brought into the room where the conversation happens. So now rather than them being like, oh, that's just the meathead strength coach, right? Who talks about X, Y, and Z. They think differently about you. So now you're included in conversations. Now there's much more of a teamwork and collaboration, as opposed to like you trying to really work to prove that you have that kind of knowledge. Like you've demonstrated some level of competence and ability in that domain. And so now it raises your level of qualification. It raises your level of expertise. But what it really does is it tells the nutritionist or whomever, right, like, you're putting in the effort to better understand how to help these people and be an active part of the team, right? So now you're not replacing them, but you have a deeper understanding of what they're asking and why they're asking it. Or you can notice things that you can let them know about certain athletes, right? Because you might be in the cafeteria, or you might be part of having conversations in the gym, right, when they're training, that for some reason or another don't come up with the dietitian or the nutritionist. Right. And now you can help be a liaison because you notice and pick up things that you wouldn't have necessarily noticed and picked up on before. And so it just creates better camaraderie. It creates a better cohesive team to help your athletes be their best selves.
It's a mic drop moment. Brian, thank you for your time. I really appreciate being able to learn from you. We're going to link everything Precision Nutrition down below, and have a great rest of the day, brother. I appreciate you.
Thanks for having me, bud. This was a great time.
Congratulations on making it to the end of the video. Why don't you celebrate by watching more videos just like it? You can also help us on our quest to placate the algorithm gods by liking, sharing, subscribing, and commenting. Thank you.